Welcome to the Humanity Dialogues. I'm Molly Brunson, Associate Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures and History of Art at Yale University. Today, I'm welcoming you as Faculty Director of the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program at the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. The Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program has sponsored this series. The Humanities Dialogues has been organized as a response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's a conversation to reflect on contingency as existence and the critical intertwining of art and politics within societies at war. Today, we're offering the third conversation in our series. And I'll ask that you please follow the link in the chat to subscribe to the Reese mailing list so that you're notified of future events. Now, as the war in Ukraine approaches its fourth week, today's topic, energy and nuclear power, is emerging as one of the most urgent questions of the crisis. And we're very lucky to have as our guests today three academic and cultural leaders on this question. Kate Brown is the Thomas M. Siebel Distinguished Professor in the History of Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is the author of many prize-winning works, including the most recent Manual for Survival, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future, published in 2019. Svitlana Matviyenko is Assistant Professor of Critical Media Analysis in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University. She is also at Simon Fraser University, the Associate Director of the Digital Democracies Institute, and she's written on practices of resistance, internet history, disinformation, and nuclear cultures. We are also joined today by Oleksiy Radynski, a filmmaker and writer based in Ukraine. Radynski is interested in the weaponization of the energy sector, about which he will share today his thoughts. He also co-founded the Visual Culture Research Center in Kyiv in 2008. Our conversation will be moderated by my co-organizer of the Humanity Dialogues, Marta Kuzma. Marta is a professor of art and the former dean of the Yale School of Art. She spent the 1990s in Kyiv founding and directing the Soros Center for Contemporary Art. So please join me in welcoming all of our guests today. Marta.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you again for this cooperation opportunity to host this series. I am very grateful, Professor Brown, for your participation, and to Svitlana and Oleksiy, я сердечно вдячна за вашу участь і за те, що ви берете участь при умовах таких. So among the first steps, as we know, of the Russian invasion into Ukraine in late February was the attack of the occupation of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, which was quite alarming. And this is one of the largest nuclear reactors in northern Ukraine. The second attack and the shelling and occupation of the Zaporizhzhia power plant made it apparent that not only Ukraine was involved in this war, but that the world could not imagine that these facilities would potentially serve as weapons of mass destruction. We were reminded of the haunting 1986 Chernobyl explosion, which reminded us, and also by those who lived through that accident and had personal experience, loss, and damage, as we were reminded by the Nobel Prize literature written in Voices of Chernobyl by Svitlana Matviyenko. And the history of that accident and its aftermath was also revisited, and in terms of its whitewashing, in terms of Professor Brown's book that we will discuss today, The Manual of Survival, An Environmental History of Chernobyl. The accident and the recent transgressions by Russia into the war and into Russia's war in Ukraine emphasizes that historically the Soviet Union's power has been centralized through the Kremlin and through Moscow, and that the reaches of that power of the Russian state seem evident over their claim and their apparent self-evident claim that they have claim over the territory and its resources. But perhaps what the nightmare that we all face now is that these energy sources, be it within nuclear power or within fossil fuels, will be weaponized. And so I would like to start with that point, Professor Brown. In your book, you have mentioned that the nuclear reactors throughout Ukraine had been the sort that actually provided for the possibility of plutonium to also be produced, so that there was not only nuclear energy produced, but there was plutonium produced for nuclear weapons. You're muted.
Sorry, sophomore movement. We're learning now, as we watch firsthand the first war ever in a nuclear country to occur, just how the military origins of these reactors are coming back to haunt us. So the Chernobyl RBMK reactor was what's called a dual purpose reactor. It's a really big reactor, very powerful, and produces potentially a lot of energy, but it also produces plutonium if you switch it over. And we noticed that the Soviets only built these RBMK reactors that were first developed for bombs. They only put them inside the Soviet Union. When they exported reactors abroad, they used a safer, smaller reactor that does not cannot be weaponized to make plutonium, the VVER reactors, which are the ones that are now what we're worried about in Zaporizhzhia and the other 4 nuclear power plants in Ukraine. So what does that mean? It means that this reactor was built on the cheap. It had no containment. It was a large reactor, so that when it started to burn, it emitted a lot of radioactivity, and it burned for several weeks. And it continues to be very hot and needs a lot of care, which is why I personally am concerned that electricity has been cut off to the Chernobyl zone, because that cover, the ukrytie, the shelter over the sarcophagus, is there, needs to be ventilated, and without ventilation, it's hot on the inside, it's cold on the outside, and all this condensation is building up, and that makes a kind of a radioactive rain falling now inside that shelter. That's a corrosive, substances that are falling down, and all the equipment that's in there is supposed to be dry, and so that corrosive qualities is going to sort of start working away, eating away at that material in ways that we really don't understand and can't really predict. So all the nuclear reactors, all 8 designs we have in the over 400 reactors that are plugged in around the world today, all come from military designs. They were all originally designed either for nuclear subs or to produce nuclear weapons. We really don't have a division between, it was artificially created between a peaceful atom and a martial atom. And we're seeing that now. The very first day of the war, the Russian army took over that Chernobyl station. The guard stepped down because they understood what it would mean to have missiles and bullets zinging around that Chernobyl plant, where there was 20,000 spent nuclear fuel rods stored in wet pools and basins. And now it appears, the shift workers are held hostage. They've been there for 3 weeks. They don't have proper beds, proper food. They don't have contact with their families. They're in a state of extreme psychological stress, and we find a similar kind of situation in Zaporizhzhia. So we're worried, right? These plant workers could make mistakes. The Russian officers who are calling the shots now don't necessarily know these plants. They could make mistakes. And then we see, the Russian army is now making this beeline for the southern nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine, and they're trying, it looks like, these are the kings on the chessboard to capture, because once you capture these nuclear power plants, you can do a number of things. One thing is they seem to be stockpiling weapons and troops there, knowing that the Ukrainians aren't going to want to fire at those installations. And they also can now control the electricity grid. And that's, the nature of centralized energy sources. If we had wind and solar sources of energy spread throughout Ukraine, and I just published an article this morning with my colleague from MIT, Susan Solomon. They would reproduce 150% of that nuclear power that those Ukrainian reactors are producing. And the Russians would have a really hard time controlling that grid. This decentralized power works better for equitable societies. It decentralizes political power. It decentralizes economic power. So we're learning how much these plants are a liability. They grew out of Ukraine as a sort of a nuclear colony. And we have all, I write about that in my book, all kinds of pretty dire situations that occurred even before 1986 in Ukraine. Dropping a peaceful nuclear weapon down a hole to put out a gas fire near Kharkiv in the late 1970s, and creating this huge explosion. Instances like that, just sort of a very cavalier attitude, especially when nuclear activities are going on in somebody else's homeland. And now we see Ukraine being treated as, sort of a new phase of nuclear terrorism, from the side of Russia.
And the question, and this is, I suppose the question on everyone's mind is, who is monitoring and how are the radiation levels being monitored? And how do we know what is actually going on and if there is imminent danger with the levels or if it's being contained?
2 days after the Russian army took the Chernobyl station, we saw a spike in there was public monitoring. We could all go on and access these websites that monitored radiation in the Chernobyl zone. 2 days afterwards, there was a spike 30 times higher at some of these stations. And then somebody hacked into those public monitors and they've been turned off since then. So we don't know. With no electricity into the zone, we don't know, even the people at the site don't know how radioactive the levels are inside the sarcophagus. We noticed about a year ago, there was a strange spike that the physicists couldn't understand. We don't know what's going on in the Zaporizhzhia site. The International Atomic Energy Agency normally has an oversight capacity, and independent oversight agents go in and check those places out. They send spare parts. That communication has been cut off. We just have to rely on statements we get from the Russians and from the International Atomic Energy Agency. I talked about in my book how the International Atomic Energy Agency was very reluctant to admit to health problems that emerged soon after the accident. And in the 5 years ensuing after the accident, they minimized, they actually hid biopsies, they sidelined and tried to fire scientists who spoke of health problems that we now can confirm were occurring. And now that International Atomic Energy Agency is making statements that say it's no problem, we don't need to worry about the basins at the Chernobyl plant that are self-heating. But I mean, what we have to remember is that on the board of governors, at privileged places held by Russia, those Russian diplomats, scientist diplomats are still on that board of governors. They have not been asked to leave, although Russia has been condemned for a violation of human rights and war crimes. So the two entities that are here to speak about that can tell us information about what's going on now are not trustworthy, I fear.
So therefore, what are the areas that are in imminent danger? For example, if the radiation levels were to rise in any of these two nuclear power plants?
Well, we've had a lot of fires with the drier, hotter weather in Ukraine with climate change. And in 2017 and 2020, we had fires that went through the Chernobyl zone. Though radiation was volatilized, that was stored in the leaf litter and in the wood, and it became smoke and ash, and that went long distances. It was recorded in Belgium and the Netherlands. I mean, that's what we're dealing with. Chernobyl, keep this in mind, Chernobyl was a bad accident. It occurred 3 years after that particular reactor started up, just 3 years. That means that was good news because that was relatively young fuel. It wasn't super irradiated by having been irradiated in those reactors for, say, a dozen years. The Zaporizhzhia plant is a different animal. It's been going for 35 years. It's got a lot of really dirty fuel stored both in the basins, which are poorly protected on site. We saw those in those aerial photographs a couple of weeks ago when that plant was taken over. And it also has containment structures with dirty fuel inside of them, in those reactors at that plant. So if the fires were to start there, they would be worse than Chernobyl. And the radiation, as we know from the Chernobyl case, will travel throughout Europe and will also blow back into Russia. In fact, the predominant winds go northeast.
It's challenging in listening to this to sort of go back in history on this subject. It's so alarming. But Svitlana, you have been working closely with Oleksiy on various projects historically as a researcher and academic on the subject of colonialism and this nuclear settlement question. And Oleksiy, you have done research further into what you refer to as the hydrocarbon war. Svitlana, if you could explain a bit about what you have been researching on these subjects.
I will, and before I do so, I also want to comment or maybe to add a couple of things to what Kate was saying. So indeed, the information that we have now is very limited, but we've just had, one of the things that I follow very closely is the reports of Ukrainian Energoatom. And just a couple of hours ago, there was a recent report by the head of Ukrainian Energoatom, Petro Kotin. And he, again, confirmed that situation hasn't changed. What we've just heard, that is continuous. But he again emphasized how dangerous it is to have military, to have the troops on the territories of both nuclear power plants. Even just in terms of technical security, it's basically absolutely impossible. But this presence, the presence of these heavy trucks, the presence of the weapon, everything, it cannot be. It already poses kind of quite unimaginable danger. He also mentioned that we heard about the strikes of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And he mentioned that because the Russian troops used some weapons that are actually quite old, not all of them, in fact, explode. And in this very moment, pieces of one of them, which is the pieces of one rocket, I believe, they actually stuck in the main transformer of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and it sits there, and it didn't explode. So it may, or it may not, but that's a kind of the situation there. And this is the main transformer for all the reactors of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. He also made some very interesting comments about the International Atomic Energy Agency reluctance that Kate already mentioned. And it's absolutely true. But this Russian lobby there, he named over 100 of specialists, Russian specialists, being there on top positions. That's what makes this lobby incredibly strong. And at this moment, at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, there is a lot of worked fuel that has to be unloaded and put in that container and sealed. When this operation is performed, the specialists from the International Atomic Energy Agency have to be present there, but they're not. And if they are there, they could be witness, right? So it's a kind of brings this whole situation to a different level if the witnesses of this kind appear on the spot, but they're not, right? So, and this particular kind of situation is incredibly troubling and also shows on how many different levels all these convergences and complicities have been happening and for quite a long time. And again, it's not only just that military occupied the territory of both the Chernobyl, not the Chernobyl is only the military, but the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. There are also, there are specialists from Rosatom there, right? So in this case, it's already state Atomic Energy Corporation sent their specialists to be there. And there are, he mentioned today, 11 people altogether from Rosatom are trying to take over the control of the technology. However, Kotin mentioned that the specialists who are working there, they actually take commands only from Ukrainian Energoatom. However, they have to agree, like they have to get approval for every tiny step that they make with the Russian military there. So this entire so-called chain of command in this current situation is incredibly complex. And the presence, again, of this Russian state corporation also on the territory of the plant is very interesting and really deserves attention and thinking, etc. So this is on that point. And now I also want to say a couple of words again about this old history that tells a lot about the situation where we are today and for which, if I may refer to Kate's book, there are no manuals for survival. And this is where, again, it's quite old. And I've been trying to study, to think about this old colonial context. And of course, we usually speak about the Chernobyl zone, almost always linking it to the catastrophe itself. But as Kate, as many other scholars pointed out, this history is long and there were many accidents and leaks, and that only, for example, if I can give you some numbers, only during 1983, from 83 to 85, there were 5 significant accidents and 63 primary equipment failures. So that, and the accidents also took place in the 70s and in the early 80s. And that territory was contaminated for a very long time. And contamination is just one thing. But if you think about nuclear colonialism, it also has to do with a kind of the Cold War. It's a Cold War narrative, and it has to do with certain militarization, and that regime, the regime of militarization and securitization, was also imposed on that territory, again, more than a decade before the Chernobyl accident. And the area which is known as Polisia, lis in Ukrainian is forest, so it was very foresty area with quite unique population living there, with very old traditions, very specific archaic language, that they even didn't develop some particular kind of identity, neither Soviet, nor even Ukrainian, but were calling themselves Tuteshny, as people who live here, with this kind of direct link to the land, to that area. And so it is like on the territory where these people lived, with this very heavy securitization regime was imposed. And it was imposed not only because the nuclear power plant was there, but also because this famous, known as a Russian woodpecker radar, right? So a huge Cold War infrastructure designed as a protection from ballistic rockets, in fact, right? So it was also set there. And because of all these two objects, in a certain way, this territory was also colonized. And what's interesting when you think about this, the border of the Chernobyl zone really coincides with that territory where this regime of securitization was imposed almost a decade prior. And you can see how this a kind of reproduction of this regime in many different ways, right, kind of is seen through decades, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And today, when I see this interest, this appetite for these particular objects that could be weaponized in a new way today, it also, for me, part of that story that has to do with, again, imperial and colonial appetites that are so much present in the narrative that we hear from Putin in all his pseudo-historical interpretations of the relation between Russia, Ukraine, and so on.
Svitlana, thank you. Before I would like to hear from Oleksiy in terms of his research and your research together in terms of the fossil fuel war, the hydrocarbon war that he's speaking about. But I would like to return back to this transfer of the centralization of power from the Soviet Union into what was then that of the Russian state, which I think perhaps is not very clear because there had been leadership in the Ukrainian SSR. But as you point out, Professor Brown, in your book, there were calls on the part of the leadership of the Ukrainian SSR to monitor this in a safer way and to deal with the accident in a more responsible way than through this slon or this whitewashing. And if you could speak a bit about that in the end everything was kind of quieted down in Moscow, in the Kremlin.
Yeah, I mean, as I went through, I worked in 25 archives, we got down to the county hospital records in Belarus and Ukraine. And you see these reports going up, local doctors saying, you know, we start to see really troubling frequencies of fertility problems, of infant mortality, of childhood illnesses, anemia, pneumonias, problems with adults. And so they start to report this up the chain of command. And then at the same time, radiation monitors on the ground are recording really high levels of radioactivity that the Russian teams are not coming up with. And so they're having these big fights about what to do over and over again. The guys just come in from Moscow and they sort of take over the meetings, and you could see it in the transcripts where they say, well, no, that's just not how we're going to do it. You know, when it comes to, you know, the parade, the famous parade, the May Day parade, the officials in Kiev, hardline as they were, you know, anti-perestroika as they were, they did not think it was wise they wanted to call off the parade, and they were overridden by these guys who came in from the Moscow radiation protection, radiation medicine people, and the radiation monitor people. The whole map of radiation, where the radiation went, where it spread, we're led to believe, you know, the Chernobyl zone is like a red flag for a bullfighter. It's, you know, saying, look over here because there's all these other problems going on all around the Chernobyl zone. So 3 days after the accident, pilots, you know, the wind shifted from northwest to northeast, and the radioactive fallout, fire is still going, is heading towards the big cities, Voronezh, Yaroslavl, and Moscow. So pilots went up and they seeded the clouds, and they let the clouds go over Gomel, about 500,000 people living there. And they let it rain in the southern Mogilov oblast of Belarus, province of Belarus. And there's a whole second Chernobyl zone there that few journalists and disaster tourists visit. But that area has levels of radioactivity just as high as right next to the Chernobyl plant. And it was populated until 1999. There are still some people living in a few forestry communities there. There's no more farming going on. But so we see these, what I was tracking was levels of radiation, frequencies of disease, and then looking at agriculture records, where the radiation was in food. This was really evident to everybody on the ground. But if you're farther away in Moscow, and you're farther away in Vienna or Washington, D.C., and you're looking at statistical extrapolations from, say, the Hiroshima studies, only looking at gamma rays, and not looking at people ingesting radioactivity into their bodies where they have no protection, then we start to see a whole different story. And so these fights were vicious on the ground. Lots of people got fired, lots of people got fined, but they continued to take the risks, kind of like we see in Russia today, where we have all these people with consciences making a defiant vote to resist against this authoritarian regime of the Putin administration. One other thing I wanted to say about Svitlana's comments is that you're absolutely right. And looking through the International Atomic Energy Agency emergency preparedness guides, I've just done that in the last couple of weeks. I've been astounded to find out that there, in all the decades of imagining nuclear disaster scenarios, no one had thought to imagine something so banal and so human as conventional warfare next to a nuclear power plant. It's just not there. And so, this guy, Valentin Haiko, who was the shift, the chief of the shift at the Chernobyl plant when the Russians took over, he calls his boss in Slavutich and he says, there's no protocol for what happens when an army takes over this plant. What do we do? And I that's just an astounding thing we're waking up to right now, of just how ill prepared we are for this event. And this event will probably affect all of us if it goes to the worst case scenario, all of us on the globe.
Thank you, Kate. Oleksiy, your research as a filmmaker is now extending to what is another danger, which is the global reliance on Russian gas, and that is involving global complicity. You refer to this as the hydrocarbon war. And if you can speak more about your research and how you're developing this as a filmmaker and as an artist.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I actually think it's pretty fair to call this Russian invasion of Ukraine the fossil fuel war or hydrocarbon war, which is, I think, actually a term that's coined by Professor Timothy Snyder at Yale, and which I think is a very good term. And there's many reasons to describe this invasion as fossil fuel war. Just one of them, of course, being the fact that the Russian war machine is being fueled even now as we speak by the money that are flowing in exchange for Russian natural gas and Russian oil from the West, right? From the countries of the EU and so on. Another important reason why is this the fossil fuel war is that, of course, the territory of Ukraine itself in the last decades of the independence of Ukraine has been, in fact, largely viewed geopolitically as this kind of major transit zone where the fossil fuels from Siberia are allowed to flow to the West, where they are getting burned into the atmosphere and emitted into the atmosphere to the detriment of humanity. But one really important and basic reason for this war to be described as fossil fuel war is the fact that the very regime of Putinism, as it emerged in the last decades and as it degraded and evolved into a fully fascist militaristic regime that could also be easily described as fossil fascist regime. So the way this regime developed is fully reliant on its ability to be exporting exorbitant amounts of fossil fuels to the West that is completely complicit, I would say, in this trajectory of the Russian state. And so it's been described many times in political theory how certain types of energetic regimes, certain types of reliance, and certain types of energy actually produce authoritarian states. Yeah, we know that from the books such as Carbon Democracy by Timothy Mitchell, where he traces the ways that carbon extractivism is actually constructing authoritarian or less democratic political regimes. And I think one way to actually see and analyze the background of this war as fossil fuel war is again in the decade of 1980s, which is actually the subject of my ongoing film research. The decade of 1980s, which of course not only the decade of Chernobyl, it's not only the decade where atomic energy as energy source has been largely discredited, and the decade that basically launched this kind of turning away from atomic energy as a major source for the modern societies, but the 80s, which is also very much a decade of fossil fuels. 1980s is actually a decade where when the Soviet Union had definitely transformed itself into a carbon empire that's been later on inherited by the Russian Federation with all of its kleptocratic and oligarchic modes of governance. And I would like just to very briefly dwell on the way this shift has happened and why it is important these days, why this history of the 1980s is extremely important these days. So basically, I think especially in the US, the audience might have heard about the case from the 1980s known as the deal of the century, which was the deal between the USSR and West Germany. And this deal kind of enabled the Soviet Union to sell its vast resources, its newly discovered by that time vast resources of natural gas to the West, to Western Germany, which was part of the capitalist world, of course. And during the Reagan era, there was a huge confrontation and a huge debate between the US government and its allies in Western Germany, who were fighting actually about this idea of Western Germans buying these vast amounts of natural gas from the USSR. The US government was arguing that this is a really bad idea, but of course not for ecological reasons, but for military reasons. The argument was reaching as far as claiming that the Soviet tanks would be fueling themselves from this kind of gas pipes when Soviet Union invades Western Germany. But the argument of the Western German government was completely different, and it was it turned to be quite interesting in a way. So Western Germany argued that by doing business on such a scale with the Soviet Union, they will actually make the Soviet Union capitalist. Yeah, that it's not just Western Germany that's going to be totally dependent on natural gas from the Soviet Union. It's the Soviet elites who are effectively going to be corrupted by these exorbitant incomes that is going to be generated by this pipe. And of course, this is not exactly the argument that the Germans were making, but in fact, what happened in reality was exactly this. Yeah, so one of the reasons for the top-down collapse of the Soviet Union, and I have to stress also in the context of what Kate Brown was saying, that the government in Moscow did not only oversee every aspect of political life, it was also overseeing the decomposition of the Soviet Union from top down. Yeah, this was to a large extent, the initiative of the political elites. And one of the major reasons for this happening was exactly this successful attempt by the capitalist West to corrupt those elites and to tell them, guys, like, you can now privatize all of this incredible amounts of natural resources. You can privatize the infrastructure for its extraction and transportation, and you can privatize the profits, while of course nationalizing the damages. And this is in a very brief description, I think, the brief historical history of Putinism that is not only the product of Russian autocracy, it's not only the product of the unfortunate ways that the post-Soviet history was developing, it's also a product of the West and of the Western complicity with this extractivist kind of relationship to national resources and to our planet. And I would just like to probably end for now with the brief statistics, some fresh statistics I've just read today that says that Russian Gazprom uses Ukraine's gas pipelines at maximum capacity right now. This is from today. So Russia's gas monopoly is currently sending over 105 million cubic meters of gas per day through Ukraine. And this is according to Ukraine's gas transmission operator system. And yeah, maybe to end this on a slightly more optimistic note, it seems that more and more people around the globe and more decision makers around the globe actually come to realize that by transition from the fossil fuels to renewables or into all kinds of different kinds of energy, we do not only save ourselves from the fascist states, from the fossil fascist regimes such as Russian Federation, we are also by the same shot kind of saving our planet.
I wanted to jump in on this note, actually, and thank you, Oleksiy, for these comments, and all of you for these comments. Please let me remind all of the attendees that you're welcome to drop a question in the Q&A. We're very happy to communicate those to our conversation partners today. But perhaps I'll get us started. And I wanted to ask a question that that has been dominating the Western press on the war in the Ukraine most recently. And that is this question about what to do and what kind of intervention is appropriate in this moment and the dangers of that intervention. You know, many are arguing, especially from the United States at the current moment, that any kind of intervention from the American government must be limited for fear of escalating tensions and increasing the threat of a global nuclear war. I'd love to hear comments from our panelists on this question. What do you think about this question, the necessity or lack of necessity of NATO intervention, of what's appropriate? It seems to me from what you've been saying, the threat is in fact already here. And so I'm wondering again about sort of how you see the future of American or international intervention. Okay, please.
I wanted to just second what Oleksiy was saying is that this has been pointed out in the press, but not really highlighted, is that day, February 24th, when the war began, was also the very same day that Ukraine cut off its electric grid from Russia and was going to reconnect it to Europe. So that, that step towards sovereignty or realigning the power grid was also the day the war began, and who knows what that connection is. But what we see, and I'll just speak as an historian, what we see historically in places like, Bosnia, Kosovo, more recently in Syria, is that everybody stands back until the aggressive power pulverizes the victimized state to smithereens. And then when, tens of thousands of people are dead and historic monuments are reduced to rubble, then the intervention begins. And in this case, especially with a nuclearized state such as Ukraine, I guess the costs of waiting, of repeating that historic precedent are much more dire. And I think we should think about, the threats, the threats that the bully makes. If you sort of succumb to those threats, then the bully becomes even more of a bully. You just, so I've really never voted for any kind of military action in my life, but I'm voting for this one.
I completely agree. And just like as Kate just said, I find myself these days in quite an unimaginable situation when myself, having been the critic of NATO all my life, and again, the way how I started my diary here in Ukraine a couple of months ago was because I was concerned with the militarization of the everyday life. So in January, I saw it, like even in front of that building aggression and everything, I was still concerned that there is a lot of kind of, actions here that my friends are trying to learn how to use guns. One day I find myself in the situation that someone wants to teach me and I can't understand how I even got there. But all this kind of subtle and not so subtle moves were the reason why I decided I need to record this and trace it because it's problematic, right? So, and then several weeks in, I also probably see that as the only thing, but at the same time, I'm just scared as everyone else because it's absolutely unclear what can happen. And I just was reading Bloomberg just a couple of hours ago, and if you've seen that, the most recent projections made by US intelligence and etc. So it says President Vladimir Putin can be expected to brandish threats to use nuclear weapons against the West if Ukrainians keep resisting. And I'm just thinking about that. And I think this is an interesting turn that the world is being mobilized to calm down Ukrainians, to stop resisting so that nuclear war doesn't start, right? So we can see how all these different flips of narrative and different types of threats are coming. And yeah, it's a so strange situation that I don't even know. I am very surprised that it kept so long for any kind of sanctions to be imposed, 8 years, but then the whole fact that Russia was a kleptocratic, extractivist, non-democratic state, which didn't stop many to keep business with this, everything that Oleksiy discussed, right? So I wonder how far we are in this situation for which indeed no manual for survival. I don't know, it's quite an impossible question, I guess, but maybe indeed more solidarity in the world is needed, because what we've been also seeing is all this fragmented discourse, because the left and the center about what should happen and whether no-fly zone is possible. Maybe that particular split that has been the work of such channels as Russia Today, operating for 20 years on the Western audiences, maybe that split, that lack of solidarity is another thing that has been weaponized at this moment to create some visible and not so visible lobbies for certain action. So if I can even say this, maybe it sounds too weak and etc. So I call for solidarity, for kind of attempts to understand better the situation, to go a little bit behind the headlines, which became another information war of its own, and just thinking about the complexity of the situation.
I can't help but listening to you speak, Svitlana, I have found that sort of what's reappearing in my mind is this image that you presented earlier of the piece of a rocket lodged on the side of into the transformer, just sort of hovering there, paralyzing everyone with this overwhelming threat. And it's, as you say, a quite unimaginable situation that you have found yourself in, and that I think many are discovering at the moment as well. I do want to be able to communicate a question from our attendees, which is a bit of a different topic, although certainly related. And in fact, it relates to this question of sort of what if the unimaginable does continue to happen. So here's the question. If the situation escalates, specifically within the nuclear power plants, do you think that enough has been learned from prior accidents, such as Chernobyl disaster, that we could have adequate medical response to those affected? In other words, do you think that enough has been learned about how to manage such accidents that this could, if the unimaginable does occur, could be handled? I don't even know what effectively means in this situation, to be totally honest with you, but I'd be curious to hear your responses to that question.
The answer is we haven't learned. And you know, one of the reasons I wrote Manual for Survival is I was really shocked by the UN figure that between 33 and 54 people died in the Chernobyl accident. And that was a number that was weaponized to say world's worst nuclear accident, and only 33 people died, so we can afford, and there was, you know, nuclear officials saying this, we can afford, you know, a risk like that. If you really look at the real toll, and this has been undone science, suppressed science, you know, you name it, but if you know, just going through the Soviet archives, it was a socialized system of medicine, so they wrote everything down. It's all sitting there. If you look at the Hiroshima studies, those studies began 5 years after the bomb dropped. They began to collect information. So they had no idea what happened in those first 5 years after people were exposed to radioactive fallout. The Hiroshima studies don't count radioactive fallout. They only count the millisecond of people getting gamma doses going through their bodies. So Chernobyl is a really important natural experiment, and we have failed to study it. You know, I was really appalled when I went into the archives in 2014 and asked for the medical records on the Chernobyl accident, and the archivist in Kiev said, "You're not going to find anything. That was a banned topic, etc." and no time at all, we found huge document collections called, in plain Ukrainian, the medical consequences of the Chernobyl catastrophe. The reason why those archivists told me they didn't exist is because no one had ever checked them out before. We're talking 30 years after the accident. So we don't know. I mean, now I see in the newspapers, they're starting to use a number closer, Ukraine gives compensation to 35,000 widows whose husbands died from a Chernobyl connection. That just counts men who died, who were old enough to be married, etc. Ukrainian officials in 2016 said about 150,000 people died in Ukraine, they guess. That Belarus and Western Russia got more Chernobyl fallout. So we have a minimum number of 150,000 people dead, but we really don't. The US National Academy of Medicine has just started this last summer a pilot study to look at chronic exposure to low doses of radiation. If you ask medical researchers right now, they're like, we don't really know about that. So here we are, 70 years after Hiroshima, and we still don't know about the most likely scenario from a big nuclear excursion is chronic exposures to low doses of radioactivity that you eat, you breathe in, you take in the water, and becomes a part of your body.
Yeah, and the new epigenetic research also shows another disturbing kind of story, right? That we also don't know anything or extremely little at this moment to what extent it can be heritable, right? So to what extent certain transformation on this cell level of the body can be heritable. So and speaking about Ukraine, I've been always so surprised that there is not much interest here in Chernobyl. And until maybe very recently, when some things, especially around the 35 years since the catastrophe and such dates, always mobilize some discussion, attention here, etc. But until some kind of date like this comes, usual response is just a distance. So I have a very limited number of people who actually traveled there or were interested somehow to study something about this. It just, on the one hand, it is trauma, but there is something even more than that, kind of research is not done, attention is not drawn, and all sort of things.
I frankly don't know what to add on the lessons of radiation, but what I can add is that maybe we can simultaneously and still learn on the lessons of the fossil fuel extraction, right? Of course, they are not so immediate and maybe also, sorry to say that, not so spectacular as the immediate outcome of radiation fallout, but I think that we are gradually starting to learn the various forms of the consequences of fossil fuel extraction, and they come not just in the form of global warming as some kind of abstraction. They do not only come in the form of heat waves or destruction of habitats and pandemics as a result, but they also come in form of really bloody wars that are fought by fossil fascists like Vladimir Putin. And maybe it's actually time to learn that this particular source of energy should become part of human history.
Yeah, there's a question about the nuclear, the transition to nuclear as a renewable in the Q&A, and one thing just to keep in mind is that just like Russia's a big supplier of oil and gas, it's also a big supplier of nuclear fuels. I think almost 80% of uranium, processed uranium on the market comes from Russia. So it does not decrease our dependence on unjust regimes.
Thank you so much, everyone. You, as sort of wonderful participants that you are, have anticipated the final question that I wanted to ask you, based from based in our Q&A from our own attendees. about sort of what's next and this transition in energy sources really being part of perhaps a manual in the making for moving forward. So allow me to personally thank you all for this amazing conversation. And perhaps I'll ask my co-organizer, Marta, if you could say a little bit about the next installment in the series.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you, Kate, Svitlana Oleksiy, for joining. Again, I want to stress how appreciative I am of the fact that Svitlana Oleksiy, you are living in this territory, in this country, and challenged by possible violence and by the destruction that has happened as a result of it. So thank you. I just had one comment, Molly, before all this. It makes me wonder how we frame an attack. And if there is something as nuclear radiation being destructive and killing, and negligence to its attending, resulting in possibly murder, then why isn't that being discussed by NATO as a weapon against neighboring countries? That's one question I have to put forward. In continuing this series, on Tuesday, we will speak about solidarity networks. Svitlana, you mentioned about solidarity, and we are speaking about solidarity networks that are happening between artists, between those who are in Ukraine and those now located in Poland and in Belarus, and also within Russia's opposition. And on Tuesday, we will have a discussion at 2:30 Eastern Time. And on Friday, March 25th, we will be speaking about the economies of art and how they may lend to Russia's diversions from sanctions at, I believe, 2 p.m. on Friday. With that, thank you again, Molly, and thank you again to all of you.
Thank you, everyone.